So, good Chodesh to everyone. It's Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, Tafshin Pei 2025. And this is the second part of a Gimel Tammuz Farbrengen. Yesterday we farbrenged about the history of Hasidism, really, and its importance, its development, and we tackled some very important subjects which are not finished at all, but we did speak about the idea of, is it proper to have multiple Rebbes? I mean, and that's a very big issue. That was in the last part of our Farbrengen yesterday. Yoni brought it up, and we discussed that. We also spoke about the four different Hasidic groups that have come, son after son, directly from the students of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the student of the Baal Shem Tov. And overall, we spoke about the Rebbe, whose Yortzeit, Lubavitcher Rebbe's Yortzeit is this coming Motzei Shabbos on Sunday, Gimel Tammuz, that any tzaddik and any Rebbe has a tradition, and you can't separate the two. So the focus of my Farbrengen part one yesterday was that when you admire a Rebbe today, you need to understand that you have to first admire Hasidism. And to admire Hasidism, you need to admire Torah. And there's a trajectory, a healthy trajectory, what we call a Masorah. That's the Hebrew word, which is the English is tradition. That famous Fiddler on the Roof song, right? Masorah, the tradition. And it's a very important thing, tradition. I would say without tradition, there's a breakdown. And that's what happened, by the way. That's what happened in the 50s and 60s in our country, where there was a breakdown in tradition. And in a way, it's happening again now. There's a big breakdown in tradition. Why tell me that a marriage is between a male and a female, not a male and a male, or a female and a female, etc. And all of these issues that we're encountering today. And just the other day, someone sent me an email about someone who hugged someone, a rabbi hugged another congregant, not a congregant, a person that came into shul, and someone went over to him afterwards and said, it's a Hasidic rabbi, you have to do tshuva because you were hugging a female. He said, what? He said, yeah, that person is really a female. There's nothing wrong to hug a female, but in the context of a rabbi and a married man and all of that, and he would want to know that this is the situation. But be that as it may, the idea is that there's a breakdown in tradition. So Masorah is for us the most important thing. Once we deviate from Masorah, we have nothing. You can have, flat ideas and fascinations. At the end of the day, there's a breakdown. And this is, Moshe, this is part of what happened and is happening to the Jewish people. The assimilation is a breakdown in tradition. Okay. But today I want to talk about the Rebbe, Farbrengen about the Rebbe. So the Rebbe is born in 1902. And his father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchok was his name, was an erudite scholar, a great Talmud Chacham, but more importantly, a Kabbalist, and a real Kabbalist. Now, what do I mean a real Kabbalist? Not a voodoo serving, Kabbalist who says, I can make a miracle, or, how much are you leaving on a table and I'll do a miracle. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a regular person like all of us here, happens to be a rabbi, happens to be a scholar, but he looks at life and he looks at Torah from a Kabbalistic lens. And it's very, very unique. And he wrote about it, and it's printed, And today there's English translations. A friend of mine has a very good translation of several. We've studied together, and he's put out some books on it. Very, very good. So he looks at the months, the years, the days, the names, all from a Kabbalistic perspective. And why is it that we, all four of us, are on this screen right now? And if we were in a room and Moshe was sitting next to Isser and I was sitting next to Menashe, he would say, what's the reason you're sitting next to him? It has to do with your name. It has to do with your birthday. That type of a vantage point is a more of a Kabbalistic one. And the Rebbe's father was a Mekubal. The word in Hebrew is a Mekubal. He was a serious Kabbalist. So the Rebbe's father was a Kabbalist. And the rabbi, since 1909, in a shul in the city of Yaktrinislav, which is the Dnieper, today they call it Dnepropetrovsk, which is in Ukraine, and it's an industrial port city, very, very prominent, has always been. And he was one of the two rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, in a shul. It was one shul. He was a rabbi, the other one was another shul. And he was there from 1909 to 1939, 30 years. In 39, they incarcerated him, they took him away, they sent him away to Siberia, and in 1944, his health deteriorated because of the conditions and everything else, and he passed away. He was born in 1878, I believe. So the Rebbe comes from that type of father. What about his mother? Moshe. What about his mother? His mother's name was Chana. We call her in Chabad Rebbetzin Chana. And she's buried. She came to America in 1947. The Rebbe went to Paris to bring her over. And she lived from 47 to 64 when she passed away. And she said those were her best years, being with her son. Now, of course, being with her husband is special, but they were very hard years for her. There was nothing to eat. There was illness, and then her husband is taken away. So it was very painful. The Rebbe's mother comes from a rabbinic family as well. A rabbinic family. They were rabbis in what's being, Nikolaev, or today it's called Mykolaiv, some of the places that were bombed in the last few years, was where they were rabbis there, Rabboni. Chabad Hasidim for generations. They were Levites, and they had beautiful voices, and they composed nigunim. That's the Rebbe's mother's side, Rebbe Tzimchana. So we have a Schneerson, the father, who, by the way, was a great-grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek, of the third Rebbe of Chabad, the third generation, Rebbe Nachum Mendel of Lubavitch, the first, which was called Tzemach Tzedek. And his great-grandson was Rebbe Levi Yitzchok Schneerson, whose son is our Rebbe. And his mother comes from the family Yanovsky. They were Leviim and prominent Chabad Hasidim, and who also was associated with the family Lavut. And there's the comments on the Alter Rebbe Siddur by Rabbi Lavut that are very important. So she comes from, that was, I believe, her father's father-in-law, I believe. Anyway.
The Rebbe wasn't a Levi, right? The Rebbe
No. Are Yisrael. So, the Rebbe is the first of three boys. The next son was Yisrael Aryeh Leib, and the third son was Beryl. Yeah. Beryl passed away, was killed by the Nazis, Yimach Shemam. And Yisrael Aryeh Leib passed away in Liverpool, England in 1952. Young man, but he did marry, I think in 1939 he married a woman named Milgram. and they had a daughter named Dalia. Dalia is still alive. She lives in Rehovot, Israel. She's your neighbor. She's in her, in her 80s, probably 85 to 90 or so. So her father was Yisrael Aryeh Leib Schneerson, but he changed his name to Gurari to get out. When he got out from Russia, he had a passport with the name Gurari. So those were the three boys. And in the memoirs of people who knew them when they were children, primarily the Rebbe's cousin Avram Shalansky, who came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was a poet and a writer. And his memoirs were documented, and I have by a woman, I forget her name now, but I've read them in Hebrew. She says fascinating things about what he said. They lived in the same building in Dnieper across the hall, I believe. And he said he would hear from his cousin's house the nigunim that the boys sang with their father at a table, and he gravitated into them. I'm not sure if his parents were frum, and even if they were very modern, and they came from Hasidim, came from Chabad Hasidim, but they were already on the modern side. That's my understanding. Shalonsky. So the house was also not only a very Hasidic house, it was a very bright house, an intellectual house. For example, Shalonsky writes that in the bedroom of the boys, there were astronomy charts. You think of what kids have today on the chart, on the walls, right? And here there was astronomy charts. In other words, there was an intellectualism. These were, they were boys, and they played. And in fact, he says, another tidbit for you guys to know, is that the Rebbe and Yisrael Aryeh Leib would have a competition who could jump over, mattresses, more mattresses. I don't know how they had so many mattresses. 1, 2, 3, you jump over. You probably, what I'm talking about. That type, and they played that way. That's my recollection for something he writes. Just showing you that, they weren't square. They had fun, okay? But they were very bright, and they were raised in a home of, milumad, intellectualism, Torah, writing, dikduk, and even Hebrew. The Rebbetzin, Hannah, was proficient in Hebrew writing. That's what I read, and that was very unusual in the early 1900s. It was unusual. I mean, Zionism was taking off, but here is a very frum woman, the daughter of a rabbi, and she marries this scholar and Makubal. And she has this strong background in Hebrew writing and language. And this also impacted, the children. So the Rebbe pretty much went to a cheder, a local cheder, and then at a certain point, the word on the street is that he outgrew his Melamed, and his Melamed told him, I really can't teach you more because you know so much and you're such a genius. So he learned with his father. Again, I don't have any sources to prove that, but that's what's said. But regardless, he did learn by a Melamed, and because we see kind of several years that we don't have him in a yeshiva, and he's still at home, and we know that he learned. Now the Rebbe also went to some equivalent of a high school, okay, This is also not so clear. A lot of this is discussed in the book Early Years, which you've seen. But if I understand correctly what I read there, the implication is he had like the equivalent of a high school studies, okay? And in fact, when he gets to Leningrad in 1927, he left his home. The last time the Rebbe saw his parents was when he was 25 years old in 1927. And he left to Leningrad because he was already engaged officially to the previous Rebbe's daughter. So he goes to his future father-in-law and his future bride. He goes to live over there. They say, again, this is also discussed in the early years, that he was a partial secretary for the previous Rebbe as a single unmarried man but yet engaged. And he goes to Leningrad, and what I read is that he graduated from a high school, or he graduated something, and he started university. Something about some secular studies I identified in 1927 in Leningrad. Okay? For the particulars, you have to look up the early years. So the Rebbe is 25 years old, full-grown man, a massive Talmud Chacham, very, very frum, and yet very educated and cultured in a way. Cultured in the sense that, you see later that when he was in France, the Rebbe wore a gray hat and white gloves. He was a real gentleman. I'm just saying, that's what I mean by cultured, together with his beard, and he was a gentleman. He knew the way of the world as far as behaving and acting and intermingling, but retaining his religiosity, his frumkeit, his chassidischkeit. Then in 1928, he gets married in Poland, in Warsaw, and that's because the previous Rebbe wanted to have a very respectful wedding, and it wasn't in Russia. Russia was closing down. Stalin was chasing everyone away and scaring everyone, so he goes over. And unfortunately, because of that, at least that's one reason, his parents did not attend his wedding. Rather, they had a wedding in their home, and they were up all night for bringing and dancing, and people who were there gave testimony to that. It's not a made-up story. Rebbe gets married in Warsaw, and then moves to Berlin to pursue a parnasa. And it's very, very important now here, this point. The Rebbe did not go to Berlin to become a philosopher and to get a degree in an academic degree. The Rebbe went to get parnasa. But in order to be able to get an engineering degree, you need to have pre-classes, and you needed to register at University of Berlin. And even to get into University of Berlin, he needed the CDH. Rabbi Weinberg was his name, who gave him the document that said that he is knowledgeable and he should be accepted. Without that, he couldn't get into university, which shows you, guys, Chevra, that with all of with his study in Leningrad, it still wasn't good enough for Berlin. You understand? You want to get into University of Berlin, 1928. You better have a strong degree. You know what I mean? Obviously, he didn't have it, so he needed Rabbi Weinberg to give him that letter, and he gave it to him. And there's a whole story with that. We're not going to go into it now, but it's all written up and printed. He gets in. He studies. And he's there till 1933. In 1933, he moves to Paris. And that's when he attends the Sorbonne, and he finishes off and gets a degree in engineering as a civil engineer, I believe. He's in Paris from 1933 to 1940, about 6 to 7 years. He's there, and that's a lot of time. But in between, he's constantly going back to his father-in-law, first in Warsaw and then in Poland, in Otwock, when he moved to south of Warsaw, 1935 to 1939, before the war broke out. So we find in the writings of his father, he's always blessing him for children. And if you have to pay attention carefully to the letters, it's very worthwhile learning those red letters. They're not, you can, if the Kabbalah is too heavy, you can just read the letter part without it. A friend of mine has done it, and maybe next time we see each other, I'll give you some, some of those copies, because it's very, very important letters, very important. I spoke Chalamoid Pesach in Kfar Chabad when I was in Eretz Yisrael, and I spoke about one of the letters. It's a short letter. And the Rebbe's father writes to him there, because he wrote him this 1928 Erev Pesach, and the Rebbe got married in November of 28. So he writes to him, he says, why should a person get married? Why should a male get married? He said, I'm paraphrasing. This makes no sense. Why should you take upon yourself the responsibility of another person? He writes that. Do you understand? Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, who's the rabbi of a shul in a community, and writes to the Rebbe, his son, and the point is, Isser, he looks to make the point that it's only because of faith. Mark, you hear that? Marrying a woman at the end of the day is faith. Faith in God, that God wants this, to build a family. But logically, Moshe, he says, why should you're a single man, you're doing fine, you're supporting yourself, all of a sudden you take someone else into your life, you have to support them. That's what he says there. That's why I say these letters are very, very poignant. They're very, very important. Anyway, so in these letters, you could see that the father and I'm sure the mother are, thinking, when is our son and daughter-in-law going to have a child? It's pretty evident, like normal parents. They want their children to have a child. He expresses it in different ways over different years. We have about, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of letters, and you could kind of, pick up a certain theme there. Anyway, some say, and I don't have evidence to this, but it might be a thought, that the Rebbe spent those years in Berlin and also in Paris, especially Paris when he was there for 7 years, because they were going to doctors to try, and the good doctors were there to help him have a child. Again, I don't have evidence, and I don't believe anyone really knows, but that's a thought that Hasidim, I heard by some Hasidim that's a possibility, because, like, what are you doing in Paris 7 years? I mean, your father lives in Warsaw, so okay, but it's not strong evidence, because Warsaw didn't have good doctors. I don't know. Anyway, comes to America. He saved. He went to Marseille and then to Vichy and Marseille. He saved miraculously. Comes to America actually yesterday. Chof Ches Sivan is the day, Hebrew day, 1941. Previous Rebbe tells the elders to go greet his younger son-in-law, who is an individual who knows Shas, Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, all commentaries and all printed Hasidic Svarim. He knows it all. That's that's what he tells. And I heard this from Rabbi Groner, Rabbi Yitzchak Groner, who was the shliach in Melbourne, he's in Noam Amos, who was in yeshiva and heard it from his teacher, who walked out of the Rebbe's room with 3 other Hasidim, and they told the boys in 770, and Groner was one of the young men that were going to the port to greet this person who they didn't know. They really didn't know, or maybe they saw him, but they didn't really know him. And he's very, very modest. There was an individual who's also passed on, Mendel the Soldat. He fought in the Korean War, and the Rebbe called him a soldier. Mendel the soldier, the Yiddish word mark for soldier is soldat. And Mendel, who I knew and I spent time with, he was a great man. And Mendel told me that he remembers seeing the Rebbe the first time in 770 at a mincha. And he had no idea who it is. He went over to Reb Shmuel Levittin, the Mashpia, and he said, who? And the Rebbe was, I think he was dressed with a gray hat and a gray suit. He looked very distinctive, distinguished. And he said, and who is that? So he says, that's the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, who he called the Rebbe, his younger son-in-law, and he's called the Ramash, Reb Mem Shin. His first name, Mem Shin Schneerson. Acronym is Ramash. So he told me he saw him, he had opened the Gemara, and he was looking in the Gemara, and very quiet and unobtrusive and all that. He works at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, not far from here. It's in Williamsburg, actually, I think, Bushwick, Williamsburg, as an engineer during the war years, and was the rabbi. Yes, Isser.
You mentioned before that he studied civil engineering, but I thought he was an electrical engineer.
Yeah, I said I think. I always get confused. I have to check.
Okay.
in early years, either electrical or civil. Thank you for the note. Anyway, so he was in a room with 300 people drafting, the draftsmen, and they say that he developed for the submarines, a light that is, under the submarine. That's what they say. I don't know. Anyway, I heard from someone, probably today he's 96 or 97, in Florida, Mark, in Deerfield Beach, and he invited me once for a Shabbaton. Anyway, so he told me, I work with the Rebbe in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He told me that. And I said, share something. He says, what I can tell you is that he was the one that got us to daven mincha every day. He made a minyan for mincha. It was the Lubavitcher. He had no idea who this man is. He had no idea. Only later did he find out that this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And then he told me that we did some very, very important clandestine work helping the Jews over the Nazis. He said, I can't tell you what, but your Rebbe and I were involved in some very important things. That's what he told me. So I can't tell you what it is, but he says it was top secret. It was top secret. Anyway, so he works there, but then his father-in-law becomes more ill, the previous Rebbe, so he needs the Rebbe. So I don't know if it's 1945, 46, 47, somewhere around those years, where I think he stops working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I believe, and or even if he didn't stop, he's much more involved with the three organizations, Merkez, Kahas, and Machni Yisrael. And then there's after the passing, the previous Rebbe, most Hasidim want him to be the Rebbe, and he doesn't want, because he knows the family of his older brother-in-law is upset, and so he plays a low key, and only after tremendous pressure, and there's a lot to talk about this, but time is short, he accepts the leadership in January of 1952, Yud Shvat, and he says the first Maimer Basi Legani, and from there he takes Chabad on, some would say, another course. Chabadniks will tell you the same course, but in a different way that fits for America. Now here, it's worth for a second to understand. We spoke about Rabbi Soloveitchik yesterday and changing from Aguda to Mizrahi, right? The Rebbe is very much a traditionalist, very much, but at the same time, innovative, so innovative, but within the confines of his father-in-law's direction. So he doesn't give away the tradition of the older generation. What he does is he takes the older generation's ideas and makes them applicable to the new generation, to the post-Holocaust generation. And namely, he rallies around his father-in-law's call in the 1940s, a fire is burning, the fire is assimilation. We need to save a Jew. Jews need to be saved from assimilation. Do whatever it is. Close your Gemaras, close your books of Hasidus, go out in the street, speak about Shabbos, speak about Jewish marriage, speak about kosher. But how can you do that? We have to learn, we have to daven. He says, there's a fire that's burning. When there's a fire, it's pikuach nefesh. And that you could say it's again, the previous Rebbe said in the 40s, but because he was ill and, he needed someone to take charge. So the Rebbe took charge, and primarily after he finally passed away, he went all out with it. And this was shocking for surely other Hasidic groups, but also for Chabad, the elders. They weren't used to this. And from 1950 to 60, those 10 years are where he established the groundwork, the ground rules. For example, women. Neshei Chabad, the women's organization, starts in 1955. This is never heard of. It was never heard of that women should have a prominent place in a Hasidic group. We had the Beis Yaakov Women's School, which was also started in 1933 or 35 by Esther Schneier, thank you. But that was learning. Here, the Rebbe is talking about outreach, women involved in outreach. It's like revolutionary. Yeah, it was revolutionary, but it was necessary. And I can tell you, my own mother of blessed memory, who was a girl, a survivor, a child survivor of the Holocaust, then was raised in Costa Rica without a Jewish school. Okay? Parents were Orthodox, but there was no Jewish education. She didn't know, she wasn't educated, and she marries my father, who's this zero haircut student in the yeshiva, right? And only eats potatoes and burnt matzah on Pesach. He's so fanatical, okay? And she wants to go to Radio City and the movies and the Big Apple. I've told you this over several times, right? And who brings her into the fold of Chabad? The women. There were women in the Chabad community who took the younger new women that came in and educated them and got them involved. And they became what we call Chasidustas, women Hasidim of the Rebbe of Lubavitch. And that was a whole culture in the 1960s. It needs to be really studied better. The culture of the women in Chabad in the 60s. In the 50s, the women were mostly from Russia, the Chabad women. So they still were kind of, they were very much with a certain mindset. But in the 60s, just as the counter-revolution of the 60s broke out, it broke out in the Jewish world too, in the Chabad world too, with the women. But the Rebbe started that in 1955. The whole idea of outreach, tzach, tzir agudis Chabad, which we have in Israel, Moshe, right? Tzach, started by the Rebbe in the 1950s in New York. Then came the tzach of Eretz Yisrael. So the 1950s to 60s, and then the whole idea of shlichus, of going out. Here are people, Isser, who were chased, were persecuted. Many of their relatives were killed. You come to the free country, you go, I can breathe finally. My old bones. Right? Comes to the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, there's no time for that. Get up and do something for another Jew. Go away to another country. Rebbe, I just came here. I don't want to say names, but I know Hasidim from another group that the Rebbe told them to go, in the last 30 years, to go to Russia, Ukraine, and they said no. Now, in Chabad, there were some parents who said no, but the kids, the Bacharim, were so Lubavitch, so Hasidic, that they said, we're doing it anyway. You see, you have a choice. You didn't give us your blessing, or we're doing it, because they were so committed to the idea and the call of the hour. And ultimately, the parents agreed, So the Rebbe introduces this idea of shlichus, leaving your comfort zone. And he spoke a lot about this in the 50s. You won't have your orange juice every morning. You won't have your baked goods. Yeah, you're going out to Wyoming. Not Wyoming now. But Wyoming 50 years ago. Or Timbuktu. That's what he wanted. So these things is what he planted within the Lubavitch system of 1950 to 60. 60 to 70, I told you, was that counter-revolution time, counter-culture, and there was that also in Chabad, with the women getting involved and the men, etc. And then 70s really starts the shlichus, and he opens 70 institutions, and things, the mivtzoyim, the tefillin, and the mezuzahs. And all of this time he's teaching Torah, saying Chassidus, and hoping and speaking about Mashiach's coming. 1980s and 1988, his wife passes away, Rebbe Tzimchaya Mushka, which was, the closest person that he had in his life, his wife. And then we have the Rebbe's passing in 1994. Give me a second. Hello? Hello? Yes? Yes? The what? To go where? So I have to bring him to Crown Heights? Okay, I'll try. I'm teaching now. I'm teaching. I can't talk. Bye-bye. So, I'm sorry. I wouldn't do that, but there's an emergency situation, so I had to take the call. Baruch Hashem, it wasn't the emergency. So, listen, the Rebbe, listening to him, Chevra, I heard the Rebbe from when I'm a child. And I saw this person yearn for Mashiach. I really did. I see a lot of Rabbonim and a lot of Rebbes. No one that I saw spoke this way. And I'm not talking about just the last 6 years of his life, where his wife passed away, and it's like, if not now, Moshe, when, right? No. You see this in 1952, Achron Shel Pesach. He said they go for a dance, right? And he says there was something called Mashiach's dance. Let us dance now, Mashiach's dance. And he jumps into the Chevron, they dance together. 52, not 88 and 1992, 52, 1952. When the Rebbe told that Times reporter, they say I'm obsessed about Mashiach, he was, but in a very positive way, in a very holy way. And this is something we can emulate, to go beyond any limitation and do whatever it is to bring Mashiach bepoel in actuality. And I argue that since it hasn't happened yet, we don't have Mashiach. That means the Rebbe's mission isn't finished. This is my interpretation of what it means the Rebbe is alive. A person is defined by their mission. His mission was to bring Mashiach into this real world. Since it didn't happen, then his mission continues. Naturally, there's a yahrzeit, we light a candle, we say l'chaim, we learn Mishnayos, we say Kaddish. But as far as the mission is concerned, it's very much alive. This is a brief synopsis of the Rebbe's life, and it's important, Yoni, to share this with your daughters in detail, not just, a general, but in detail. Review these last two Farbrengens online on YouTube, so you have details, and share them. So especially your daughters, they're the future of the Jewish people.
So great.
What? I didn't hear you say. So I'm just saying that, and our grandchildren, children and friends, it's a special time, and that's what the Rebbe writes, that on the yahrzeit, besides all the yahrzeit minhagim, starting with the lighting of the candle, which we should do Matzah Shabbos, and the saying of Mishnayos for the Rebbe's name, to give tzedakah, and to share with other people the Avas Yisrael of the person. That's what he writes about the previous Rebbe, so the same applies to him. So everyone should do that, should do that. Hashem should help us. We should have the Geula Shleima and a good Chodesh. And do you have anything you would like to say, or anyone?
Rebbe,
Yes.
question. If I recall, because when I go to the Ohel, I try going around to a lot of the farm. Is the Rebbe's mother also Chana also buried there near the Rebbe?
Yeah, she passed away in 1964.
Right?
But she has a separate place. That's another story for another time. Why that is? I actually just go ahead.
Because when I called you from there the first time many years ago, and I found Rav Kazanovsky,
yes,
it was very close to Rav Kazanovsky's kever, like mamish right next to it.
Not next to it, across. Kazanovsky's on the men's.
Across.
The men and women are separated in the Chevra Kadisha section of Chabad, not in other sections in the Ohel. The entire cemetery doesn't belong to Lubavitch, only a very little part, a small part. In that section, men and women are separate. So the Rebbe said, what?
The two Rebbitzins, Chaim Mushka and the Rebbe, they're also very close.
Yeah. The Rebbitzins of three Rebbes, the Rashab's Rebbitzin, Shternesara, the Chamadina, the Rayatz's Rebbitzin, and the Rebbe's Rebbitzin, Chaim Mushka, those three are one next to each other. Then there's a separation, and the next one over with the separation is the Rebbe's mother. Okay? Just for the record, since you mentioned that the Rebbe bought 8 or 9 places so that no one should be around his mother. And it's that way till today.
Wow. Yeah, I was always wondering why it was like empty over there.
The Rebbe never explained, but that's what he did. And in fact, when he came there after he bought it and his mother was buried, he realized there was one woman buried towards the end of that, and he came to the head of the Chevra Kadisha. He said, I forgot. He forgot to tell the Rebbe there was one out of the 9 or 8, there was someone there, so what should he do? Okay. But in other words, there is I think Daladamas, you have to, the Chevra Kadisha, there's an inyan of being, maybe, I'm not saying maybe, the person buried there wasn't a Shomer Shabbos. Could be. And people were makbid in that, to be, maybe that's why he wanted to create kind of a border separate. So when he saw that, he said, like, but that's the way it is. But everyone else, it's empty. Yeah. Hevra, Mashiach now. I wish I could be with you, and I wish you guys could be here at to celebrate together. Shavoni Simchas. We'll be back on Monday with Hashem. Zay Gesund. Thank you. Bye bye. Take care. Bye bye.